What does it take to make workshops work? And how can we facilitate collaboration that sticks and leads to results? My name is Miriam Hepnes, and with the Workshops Work podcast, I'm on the mission to find the magic ingredients that make workshops work. Today with me on the show is Viren Thakrar, and we speak about serious games and how to use them for team development, team performance, and beyond. So stay tuned. And by the way, if you don't have pen and paper at hand to take your own notes, scroll down to the show notes to download my free one-page summary. And now, lean back and be inspired. Viren, welcome to the show.
I know. Welcome. Thank you for having me in person. This is awesome.
In person, we're recording in a podcasting studio in Melbourne. And I honestly feel like Joe Rogan. So I'm very tempted to just open the conversation with, so how are you today?
Is that how Joe starts the podcast? Yeah.
He usually just goes into it since it's long form and they don't have an ending, so it can take up to 3 hours. They just start wherever.
Oh, wow. Well, you're hoping Spotify now picks you up for a big multi-million-dollar podcasting deal?
Yes. So Spotify, if you're listening, I'm up for it.
You're up for it?
Yes. And today we're going to speak about team performance and games. And I can read your t-shirt In the Game, which is the name of your company. And you've been on the show before. So what does In the Game mean to you?
Ooh, what does it mean to me? So many things if we go... I mean, it's, I guess it's my business. And I think I was having this conversation with someone the other day. And when you start a business, it's a part of you and an extension of you. So In the Game, what does it mean to me? Well, it's an extension of who I am and what makes me me. So there's that part, which is the less tangible part, I guess, to describe. And then tangibly, I think In the Game, I've bounced this around because the name of the business came up. It was more of a random generation. And then I think over time, it's evolved to get its own meaning. I think if I go the main thing for me within the game, I think over time has been to succeed and perform at anything. You need to bring people into the game. And I think that's ultimately kind of what I've landed on in terms of its meaning for the type of work that I do. It's about bringing people into the game. And
it's funny to onboard them, bring them on the board, and which makes me think of a board game.
Yeah, well, and this is the funny thing. It's spun out. So it's obviously got the game reference, and that talks back a little bit about how I do things. I think In the Game also has this aspect of the mental side of things, so being in the game and being present. So over time it's kind of evolved. Yeah, it's kind of picked up a few different meanings. Yeah.
Awesome. And you mainly focus on team performance, team building. And I recently gave a training for coaches and trainers about facilitation. And the big question was, so what's the difference to team coaching? So when you think of team building and the work you're doing, would you consider it facilitation or coaching or training? And where do you see the difference?
Yeah, and actually, even to throw something else into the mix, I actually talk a lot about what we do as team development. I think team building is the easy way to describe it for most people to get. So if you're talking to someone that's not in our space and you say, look, it's a version of team building, what we do, people kind of get it. Team development's a little bit abstract for them. But when I'm talking to people like us, I consider what In the Game does as team development. And really for me, that's about looking at a group and getting them to work more effectively together, ultimately, so that they can perform better, they can grow together, they can come up with, better ideas together. And I also say when you have that team also then creates a bit of a magnetic culture as well. So then it also attracts great people to the team and it also keeps them there as well. It's a long-winded answer, but I kind of look at it as team development's probably, I feel like, a better description of what we do. I then don't get too caught up in, is it facilitation? Is it coaching? For me, personally, that distinction doesn't matter too much. Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting. I've never thought of the distinction between team building and team development, but team building almost feels like, okay, it's a new team, so we need to build something from scratch. But if something is already there, then team building feels like there's something lacking, as opposed to team development where you build on top of something that already exists.
Yeah. And I think the other part as well as team building, I think has some negative connotations associated with it. You say to someone, hey, we're going to do some team building stuff.
And everyone
Usually,
goes,
to a person in a team is rolling the eyes. Oh no, what are we going to do? What are you going to force me to do? And I feel like it's got a whole bunch of negative stuff associated with it. And for me, the development piece also is it's not just a one-off intervention. I'm really not a big fan of, hey, let's just do one workshop and that will fix everything. For me, it's an ongoing process. It's there's rhythms and rituals that a team should be undertaking consistently to develop and perform. And so that I think that's probably another reason why I like the term team development better than team building.
And I would like to pick up something that you just said, that team building has a negative connotation because everyone thinks of, there will be a workshop and are we going to play silly games?
Yes.
So when I think of team building, we're going to play silly games. And here we are speaking about team development and your company name is In the Game.
Yeah.
So what's the difference between the air quotes silly games that everyone is afraid of and then you call it team development and still you're playing games?
Still playing games. Oh no, he's just rebadged it and called it something different. I think the way I look at it is there's nothing wrong with silly games necessarily. So I think it's all about picking the right type of thing for the right time. And I think there is a time and place to do more lighthearted things that are less serious. So there is a place for that. But I feel like often organizations think that's it and that's all there is to growing and developing a team is, hey, we'll just get everyone together and we'll have, a social event once a month and that will help the team perform really well. And I go, it doesn't. It's a very surface level sometimes. Those let's call them silly initiatives or lighthearted initiatives. They're often very surface level, and they don't have a long lasting impact. And in fact, actually, they're often not done very intentionally in organizations, and that can actually make the issue worse. So let's take the example of Friday drinks as a classic.
Mm-hmm.
Nearly every organization will have Friday drinks. In the classic good old days where everyone was coming in, it was like 4:00 on a Friday. Well, you've all of a sudden 4:00 on a Friday. So anyone that has any responsibilities that are to do with Friday evenings can't take part. Some people don't drink. And all of a sudden you start creating these cliques. And the intentions are fine. They're good. We want to bring people together socially. They can connect. But if they're not intentionally designed, they end up making the issue worse. So I've gone off on a big tangent, but I think the difference between some of the team development stuff and the lighthearted stuff is it's looking at ongoing conversations that teams should be having to help increase or improve the way they work together to have a longer lasting impact on team performance.
So you mentioned conversations and games. So how do conversations and games fit together? And I find your example of the Friday drinks very compelling, especially when we speak about inclusivity. So what if someone doesn't drink? And how do we deal now with remote teams? Maybe the Friday drinks are the only way to bring people into the office, but is it really the right incentive? Doesn't it need some team development first so that the team wants to come into the office without the drinks?
It's a really good point. Don't just rely on that one surface level initiative. Actually lay the foundations, lay the groundwork. And then some of those things that you want to do, like bring people in, it's more compelling for people to do it.
Yeah. So how does it then work if you say that team development is not just one workshop? It's not the silly games just to have everyone kind of laugh and connect, but to build some deeper structures. Or where do you start? Is it then important to know the personality types of other team members?
Yeah. And I think that's certainly a decent starting point. So I think for me, often the entry point often is, look, let's focus on interpersonal connection. That's usually one of the best places to start, because I find by starting on interpersonal connection, you're building trust. And we know by building trust, that's got a lot of positive knock-on impacts. As soon as I know that the person I'm talking to, they are a person, they're not, I truly believe most people aren't being annoying on purpose. They're a person, they've got their own goals. And as soon as I start connecting with someone to go, that person, they play basketball on the weekends, they love going out to see their family on Sundays to have a dinner. And as soon as I just start understanding more about that person and who they are, those issues I realize they're not trying to do it purposely to annoy me. That person is a person. They've got their own goals. They've got their own objectives. You start trusting their intentions more. And then you can start having more productive conversations about what's going well and what's not. So I often say more connection orientated is a great place to start. I do think some of the team types, team styles, team personality stuff is a part of that. I think if you can start understanding that me and you, we're maybe different from the way we see things, again, it humanizes that aspect of it's not you're trying to annoy me, it's that you look at the world differently to how I look at it. And actually, if we look at the bigger picture, that's a good thing.
Yeah.
That's actually going to be better for the team.
Exactly, because a team needs to have complementary angles.
Absolutely.
To see what...
Yeah, that high level of cognitive diversity. So the more we can have that in a team, it's going to be better for how the team performs and comes up with ideas. But it's a little bit more awkward because if everyone's the same, it's much easier.
Yeah.
But it's not better.
Yes.
From an outcomes point of view.
Yeah. And it's cognitively, it makes total sense. Emotionally, on a day-to-day basis, it's just hard work.
Yeah, it's harder work. Yeah.
And then what also comes to my mind is that the annoying person is usually not about their personality type or about that person, but it's about me, how I perceive that person, because this person triggers something in me.
Yeah, for whatever reason.
Right? Yeah. That reminds me of my childhood when I never got to play with this one toy.
Yeah.
And I think to get the awareness in the team members, that to appreciate each other for who they are and find commonalities. So this makes a lot of sense. So if I understand correctly, you would start with the interpersonal level. So the person behind the role to create connection. And then would you look at what works or what doesn't work?
So I think even with that, looking at the interpersonal connection piece, and I call it kind of meaningful connection. So I think, that needs to be ongoing. It can't just be, hey, we've done it once and that's it, it's done. I think it needs to be an ongoing focus. And I think this is probably where most organizations go wrong, is they might do something like a team styles and they do that and everyone's like, oh, I can see why this happens. And then you get maybe a short-term boost from that because people are really aware. And if we don't pick that up again, people just get back into their old ways of doing things, which I think is perfectly natural. So I think the connection piece needs to be an ongoing activity. Now, you can mix up how you get people to connect. You might do a team styles thing one time, you might do something else another time, but it needs to be an ongoing focus. My view's grown to be none of this stuff is linear. So we can't view it as a linear step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4. Connection's a good place to start, but you could start from another place as well.
And before I ask about the games, because I think that's a good entry point. What do you think of personality tests, these MBTI, right?
I could go on a really big tangent here, so you can cut me off if you want to. But
small tangent. Yeah, I'm really curious because I think a lot of the listeners have done or use one of those tests, and I would just be curious about your honest opinion.
Well, and the reason I say I could go on a big tangent is this is where my career started out, was in personality assessment. So I started out in that space. And I think if we keep it really broad, there's 2 ways to approach how we measure personality. You've got the type-based tools, so things like MBTI, DISC, HBDI. There's a whole bunch of tools which will say, hey, you either fit in this box, you're this color, you're these combination of letters. And then there's these trait-based tools, which will basically say, look, there's 32 traits of personality and you fit somewhere on a scale across those 32. And immediately you can see there's a big difference. There's one which is very simple. You get into a box, very easy to understand. And one which is very nuanced and complex because you've got 32 traits. They all kind of interplay and there's almost like an infinite combination of personality traits that come together. So it's not so linear and clear cut.
Which makes sense.
So that makes more sense. And that's probably more like how personality operates than your one certain type. But the benefit of the type-based tools is if someone has, like a team has no idea about these things, they're like, it's such a good entry point into talking about personality. So actually, even though I'm not a huge fan of those type-based tools, I use them because it's a great to start the conversation around. We're all different in this room. We all bring something different to the table. Let's talk a little bit about where those differences emerge. What does that mean for how we interact with one another? What works and what doesn't? Where does it cause conflict? And what can we do, from a style flex perspective at an individual level to adapt better to the team? It's great for introducing that conversation. Yeah. But as a tool to really deeply understand yourself and your personality, the trait-based tools are much better. And the only other thing I'll add to that without going too far off is I think sometimes just relying on the tools, it also underplays the impact of your context and situation. So I think sometimes people are like, this is what it's told me. But I think the environment and situation has such a big impact on how those traits play out as well. So it's super complicated. And I think sometimes there's a tendency to simplify these things.
Yeah. What just crossed my mind is, how much information do we actually need about everyone's personality type? Because of course we're very curious about our own, but how much do we need to know about our coworkers? So maybe it's actually good to keep the complexity simple, unless it's for the interaction between the team leader and their staff. And the other thing that just crossed my mind is the impact of team dynamics, because I can imagine, and maybe that's too far-fetched, but when I think of family systems, very often in a family, as a child, we take on the role that is actually left out. So everyone has a role to play, and however, what our personality is, we take that up. And I can imagine that in a team, if there is a free role, someone would be rather taking that up, although it's not their real personality. Does it make sense?
That makes complete sense. Yeah, and I think this is where the environment we're in plays a big role. So, I'm not naturally a very organized person, but if I'm in a group and it seems to be lacking organization, I will probably, it's part subconscious. I'll come in and I'll start filling that role a little bit more. And it's completely not my natural style. And so it's the situation, the group dynamics of a certain group means I start playing more of those traits. So it's not super clear cut.
Yeah.
But the tools are useful to start the conversation, and the kind of the type-based tools are really useful for people that have not really considered the personality side very much. It's such a good introduction to people are different. People look at the world differently. We need to interact differently with each other, and we need to consider the strengths everyone brings, no matter what their kind of style. So I do think there's a role for them in the team development process. Yeah.
And maybe even to raise awareness that maybe someone is picking up a role that is not natural. So maybe they cannot be their best selves.
That's right. These interesting conversations start emerging, which is, often an interesting exercise with these is guess where your team members are. And, you might guess that, Miriam sits over here. And then you see Miriam's results come back and you go, that's different. That's worthwhile exploring a little bit and having a conversation about. Why does that difference emerge? What does Miriam feel about it? And they're the interesting conversations. And I think that's the type of conversations we need to be having more of. And I think these tools, if they're facilitated well, they'll help these conversations happen. And then it's less about the tool and more about the conversation.
So let's double click on that one. So how can you, and I don't want to hijack the conversation into personality tests, but when you say if they're facilitated well, so what would be the big, maybe red flags or the mistakes we can avoid if we're using these personality tests in a group facilitation process?
Great question. So I think the first big kind of thing to avoid is really taking these things as gospel and saying whatever these results come out as is fact. I think that's a really good starting point. So, especially tools like MBTI, when you start digging a little bit deeper in the science, they're not super robust. So if we kind of accept that and go, look, this is not a super robust tool, but it could start an interesting conversation. And I think looking at it as, okay, this has come up, it's brought some interesting things up, but these things are not necessarily fact. So we're just going to use it as a platform for conversation. I think that's part one of facilitating it well. And by extension of that, part two is dig deeper and have the conversation. So really just look at it, the tool as a platform for a conversation around how the team works better together, where the different strengths are, where the points of friction are. And I think where I see the tools not facilitated at all is that we steer away from that because it's a little bit messy and it's a little bit, that's where sometimes you get the heated conversations, but we kind of almost need to lean into that when we're facilitating these types of sessions.
And what I hear, or the danger I see, or the skill is to take enough time for this conversation to go deeper than just the surface and understand what it means and what it means for the team without going too deep, so that it's kind of a group therapy session where everyone is exploring their own personalities and talks about their child, which certainly at some point has its place, but maybe not necessarily.
Not necessarily. And I think this is with any workshop comes down to we're usually running workshops with certain parameters at play. We sometimes have a certain amount of time. So I think we've just got to think what's going to be given the amount of time we've got for right now, how can we best spend that time together with the team to help the team grow and develop?
Yeah. Which brings me back to the earlier question about the difference between coaching and team development. And it seems like a fine nuance. So the way how I understand it, I would like to hear your opinion, is that team coaching is how are we working together as a team, given all the personalities. And a facilitated team process would be how do we as a team achieve a goal together? So it's more on the process.
So, and I think I mentioned earlier, I don't get too caught up in the distinction between the two. And I might be just being naive. For me, it's not super relevant splitting the two things out. Like if I'm running a session, I'm sometimes using more coaching orientated skills. Sometimes, and we know that there's a big overlap between those facilitation skills and the coaching skills. Sometimes I'm facilitating more of a process. So this is probably not going to help answer your question very much, but I haven't really taken the time to separate the two out. And for me personally, I don't see the benefits in doing that, but I'd love to be challenged on my thinking. I might be being naive. And
to be honest, I love your pragmatism. Thank you. Maybe I just copy your answer next time I'm asked.
And if someone comes up with a good reason to separate the two out, let me know, because I'm willing to be challenged that. I might be brushing under the carpet something which I need to tackle, and the easy way of doing that is saying it doesn't matter, or there might be some merit in what I'm saying. So I don't know. I might be wrong.
And I think as long as we're serving the group and facilitating the conversation they need to have, whether it's to achieve an outcome or to work better together.
And even if I get pedantic, I kind of go, if you work better together, you're more likely to achieve the outcome. So yeah. I don't know. Whether it's worthwhile being pedantic about these things or not, I don't know. Yeah. I haven't really concerned myself too much with the differentiation.
Yeah. So let's go back. Okay, so leaving the tangent.
Yeah, coming back.
You spoke about rhythm and rituals, and you spoke about the team development project being a process. So where do games come into play? Because up to now, everything sounds very serious. We have conversations, we need to understand each other's personalities.
Well, this is where the two words you've said combine together, which I call serious games. So the games are more serious in nature. They help teams have these conversations, which are usually harder to have. But what the games do, and this is where I think the games bring in magic, is they automatically add some level of fun and safety to the conversation. So ordinarily, if a leader just stands up and asks a question, and not usually asking these questions, you sometimes will get a little bit of a wall and people won't necessarily engage. The magic is, and it's how people's perception of games and the way game mechanics work, is you put these conversations through a gameplay process, and all of a sudden people start opening up a lot more and they start sharing a lot more than they ordinarily would. And I think if the games are designed well, they will make the process inclusive, they'll make it fun, they'll make it engaging. And I consider it's a bit like magic, it's ordinary conversations that might be very difficult to have. They're easier to have when we've got a game in front of us.
And so if I understand correctly, especially your example, the team leader can stand up and ask a question, a quite personal question, and then everyone is like, wants to hide below the table or go offline. And a game that could be just pulling a card with the same and reading out the question that has been given by the game gods.
Yes.
Change the dynamic that suddenly team members would be more open to answer it.
Completely. And especially if you wrap that question up in some gameplay process and mechanic.
So what makes the difference and what's the process and mechanic behind it?
Well, I think when we play games, we not necessarily everyone's got a really not everyone loves board games, for example. So that's, but people, when you think games, there's automatically, you're all of a sudden almost remove yourself from, hey, I'm having this really serious conversation to I'm just playing a game. And I think that mental shift helps people approach those conversations pretty differently. I think the other part is often team leaders that are running these kinds of sessions, they don't know what questions to ask. So all of a sudden this deck that magically asks good questions that you can ask to the group, that's really helpful as well. It gets around kind of the bad questions, the leading questions. And then I think depending on the game that you're playing, games will often have some kind of theme. They'll have some kind of interactivity mechanisms. And all of these things, what they do is, I guess it goes back to the original point, they help shift people's mindset to, I'm not having this really awkward conversation. I'm just playing a game. And games are light, games are fun. And before you know it, you've played a game and you've had some meaningful conversations that you've probably been putting off as a team.
And you mentioned a good question. And I get that. It's easier to provide a team leader with a bunch of prepared.
Yeah.
Something with pre-prepared questions instead of coaching them how to ask a good question.
Yeah.
And if you're designing a question deck, that it must be able to apply to any team lead because you don't know who's going to play your game.
Yeah.
So how do you make sure that it's a good question, independent of the context of the organization, the cultural context, who's pulling that card?
Yeah. Great question. I think one thing you do, you try and make the questions fairly broad so they'll apply to most teams. But I think with any game, you build in mechanisms to redraw cards. So over time, I think what happens is team leaders play, they get better at playing the game. They get better at judging, what kind of questions are coming up, what questions right for the group, which questions you can skip, and then you can ask another question. But once people get even more comfortable, they'll start kind of adding maybe their own. They might read a question which is fairly generic or doesn't quite apply. And so this is what will happen if I'm running the game is if I get a sense this is not the perfect question, I'll just go, let's look at this question. Let's use it as a bit of a prompt instead of looking at it really literally. So you just adapt it. So if you look at the card as just a bit of inspiration, and you can just, as the facilitator, you can tweak it and go, well, it says this. In our context, probably let's focus a little bit on this instead. But the card's done a lot of the work to get you thinking of the things that you should be asking.
And this is now getting in an interesting direction because this is where facilitation comes in. So if I understand correctly, it's not a game that the team can just play amongst them, but it needs a facilitator. Does a facilitator need to be external?
So this is a really good, so these are questions actually I'm toying around now because the games that I'm building at the moment, they have a role of host, but the host can also play. So the game actually takes you through the process. Now, what I've come to realize in kind of observing these sessions is someone who is more skilled at being a host or facilitator, they won't just whiz through the game. They'll notice interesting things, patterns and trends that are coming. And to steal your phrase, they'll double click on them. Whereas I think if you took it literally, let's say you didn't have a facilitator, you could still have a good quality conversation. It just won't be as good as if there's someone that is playing that host role. Now, that host doesn't need to be external, but there is a beauty in sometimes having conversations facilitated by an external because they may go somewhere where a team leader might not go. They may see trends that the team leader might not see. And the team leader sometimes needs to be a part of the conversation and process. And it's very hard to wear the hat of facilitation and being in the conversation at the same time.
And I can imagine that there are some questions that appear very naive, but in the context of a team, suddenly they are very loaded. And where a team leader might, or someone who's involved might avoid that, an external neutral facilitator might just lean into it and maybe provoke the conversations that the team actually needs.
Absolutely. Yeah. So even if you like a simple question like, what's something you feel like the team has done well recently? It seems like a nice question, pretty soft. And you might read the answers. They might all seem fine. And a facilitator might then read the answers and go, these are actually I can notice a pattern here. They're all really surface level things. This is telling me something. So you might not tackle that thing immediately. You might say, let's see what comes up in some of the other conversations. And you might notice that actually everything's really at the surface level. The team isn't processing things or talking about things at a deeper level. So that then you might bring that up. And I think these are all the wonderful things that facilitators do when they run these types of sessions.
So would then be, and maybe this also includes then what you mentioned as rhythms and rituals. Is the entire process then facilitated, or is this kind of, how can you enable the team to create this rhythm and ritual so that they are not becoming dependent on the facilitator?
Absolutely. I think self-sufficiency is if we want these things to happen more regularly, we need to equip the team with the skills to do these things. And that's where I hope the games do this. I think my philosophy is, let's say a team plays the game and they have a really good conversation. Let's say it's 80% of the way there. And a facilitator might be able to take it to 100%. So you've got a little bit of a drop off. But having an 80% conversation is better than having a 0 conversation. So actually, even if it's not quite perfect, the fact that they're doing it, they're playing the games, they're having these conversations, and let's say they're building other rhythms and rituals where they're having these types of conversations, even if it's not perfect, it's better than not having these conversations at all. And then I think you do, like, there might be certain conversations or points in time where you bring in someone external. And external doesn't mean they have to be, external to organization. You can just go to another team and go, hey, team leader from the other team, can you just come in and run something for us? We've seen you run sessions before. You're really good at facilitating things. Do you mind coming in and spending an hour with the team just to do something independently and having independent eyes? So I think external doesn't need to mean external to the organization.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And this has even more advantages because it builds bridges between teams. They learn about maybe different units, make new connections, build trust.
Oh, absolutely. And look, I think I'm a really big fan. Once you start getting, let's say you've got your own team rhythm and ritual going well, start building rhythms and rituals with other teams. Because I think that there's so much power in the cross-functional bringing teams together for many, many reasons. Like I think, breaking down silos, fresh ideas, fresh perspectives. I think there's just so many benefits to the cross-functional aspect.
So what do you mean exactly by rhythms and rituals?
So my take, rhythms and rituals, again, I try and keep these things relatively simple. I think it's things the team is doing regularly, almost like clockwork. So you can almost say, look, the beginning of every quarter, we're going to get together as a team and we're going to set our goals for the quarter. And at the midpoint of the quarter, we're going to have another thing where we're going to check in on the goals. And at the end of the quarter, we're going to do a reflection on how we went and set our next goals. And you could almost set your watch, your calendar by that. And I think I try to look at it, try and build rhythms and rituals. So that example, I'd say, is around goals. So rhythms and rituals around clarity. Try and build rhythms and rituals that are about connection. Try and build rhythms and rituals which are around collaboration, and try and build rhythms and rituals which are around celebration. I think that they're really 4 good areas to, if you're like a team and go, oh, I want to do some more of these things. Look at those 4 areas and go, how can I, over the course of a quarter, 3 months, how can we have a good rhythm which addresses each of those different areas?
Nice. I'm glad I asked the question. Yeah. And would you then, for each of the 4 areas, are there specific games that you would play to facilitate that?
But I do. There's definitely games I will lean on for those 4 areas. But it's not just limited to those games, but there's certainly games that are connected to each of those.
So it's a different type of game you would use for goal setting, for connection, for celebration. What was the 4th one? Collaboration.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a different game for each of those areas.
How do you choose what kind of game to use for what kind of challenge or ritual or topic?
So I think part of it is looking at the team and kind of going, what does the team need right now? So if we're kind of just doing a one-off, or like, let's say it's just we're coming in and we're like, okay, the team seems to be on the wrong path. They need to be on the right path. I think it's just doing a little bit of deep diving and digging and talking to the team. Sometimes you can go back to things that already exist, like culture surveys, and just having a look at those areas and saying, what does the team seem to be missing now? A bit of work that I did last year with some organizations was helping build a diagnostic. So you run a diagnostic with the team first. That tells you the areas where the team feels they're doing well and not so well. And then you decide what interventions you put in place from there.
So a diagnostic would be an area that you would not gamify?
It has not been not gamified yet, but I think this is could be for the future. Like I could definitely see how there could be a diagnostic-based game that you play where the team kind of evaluates what they're doing well and what they're doing less well. It's not a game I've developed as of yet, but I think with any of these things, there's ways to gamify them.
So what makes a game? I can imagine. Okay, you pick a card and you read out a card. Maybe it's already a game. Then does a game need to have a winner and a loser, or a board, or a clear set of rules, I guess?
Great question. Look, I think from my perspective with the game, you've got some of the things you've spoken about there. Games will have usually components. So if it's a game, so we look at a game, you can just have a game that's just a deck of cards. There's plenty of games that are just classic 52 cards, and there's millions of games you can play. So you've got the game components. I think that's an important part. Mechanics is another piece. So what are some of the rules? And I like to look at these things in terms of the gameplay loop. So I think what's the loop here that someone's going to repeat over the course of a game? And sometimes that loop can be really short, and sometimes that can be a slightly longer loop. But what's the core loop that they're going to be undertaking in the game?
And loop means every player of the game does the same thing.
Exactly, multiple times.
Okay.
And usually the loop will be, they'll do something, there'll be an action, and based on that action, there'll be some form of feedback. So there'll be like a feedback loop in there as well. And that should dictate something that happens in the game. And so you get into that loop of, I do something, I get some feedback, something happens in the game. I do something, I get some feedback, something happens in the game. And so I think games they don't have to, but I think they should have a nice gameplay loop, because that's what makes the game fun. If that core gameplay loop is fun, you'll keep coming back to playing that game.
And what makes it fun? Are these brain chemicals? So you're poking dopamine or serotonin or one of those? Oh, how do you make it fun?
So I think fun is one of those funny ones because everyone has a different idea of what is fun for them. I think the core things that go into something being fun, it creates some level of engagement and flow. So you do the thing, and it makes you lose track of time. For me, that's an important part of fun. It's an engaging, mindful experience. So it doesn't matter if you find, cooking fun, knitting fun, whatever your view as fun is. Normally it's fun because you get immersed into the activity, and it creates kind of a sense of flow for you. I think some of the other things that help create fun are things like variety and novelty. So I think not knowing what's coming up, there being a sense of variety, I think that helps create fun. I think other mechanics that help create fun, although I think we've got to be careful in a business context how much we lean on these mechanics, are things like competition. It can engage us and can make things enjoyable and fun for us. I do think sometimes fun can be things that make us laugh as well. So I think there's a bit of a combination. I don't think there's you have to check every one of those boxes. I certainly think you've got to check the engagement and flow box for it to be a fun experience. But whether it makes you laugh out loud or whether it really immerses you, they can both be different types of fun that you lean into.
Can it be too much fun? Because we're still speaking of a professional context of serious games, of team development. If it's too much fun, is there always development for fun?
Well, I'd say the fun is only a problem in a business context if it really starts detracting from the outcomes that you're trying to achieve. And I think this is where sometimes the light-hearted interventions we might do might make everyone laugh. They might be really engaging, but they don't build towards any ongoing outcomes. So I'd say then in that situation, there's too much of the wrong kind of fun. I hate saying the word wrong because it's not as prescriptive as that, but it's not necessarily fun that's serving then the team to grow and develop. But let's say you're coming to work and everyone comes to work every day. They have an absolute blast because they get along so super well with everyone. They love the mechanics of how the team works. Everyone is doing super meaningful work. They love it. They're so immersed in it that they could literally, if you didn't tell them, hey, go home, they'd be there doing their thing. is that a bad thing if everyone's doing that every day? I personally don't think that's a...
If you ask the families at home, maybe.
Maybe there. That's right. There's probably the whole balance side of the equation. But if people are coming in and they're really enjoying being at work because they find it fun, I don't think that's too much fun. I think it's only when it starts really detracting from what, what teams should be focusing on.
And what I hear is if it's basically this feedback loop is missing. So if the fun bit, what the team's doing, does not inform the next loop or the next step.
Yeah. I think if there's a lack of the loop, the lack of that kind of growth loop. And again, I think there is a time and space for some of the lighthearted, let off some steam, just get together and have some fun that doesn't necessarily have this objective at the end of it. I think the problem is when that's the only thing or that's the predominant thing that teams do to build their team chemistry connection. That's problematic because it doesn't meet that objective. Yeah. Yeah.
And I guess that, and that might be where the bad connotation comes from, is that at the end it feels like maybe a waste of time because yes, we had fun, but usually I don't go to work to have fun because I have my own friends.
Yeah. Well, this is, that's not often for most people. It's not the primary. Yeah. Although I would, if you're in a position where you do have the luxury to kind of choose where you're working, I would say that should go up in the priority list. Like I think we spend so much time at work, and if you're at a place which makes you miserable and you're in the position where you do have the luxury to choose where you work, definitely question if you're in a place that makes you miserable.
Yes.
To amplify the fun you have.
True. And I have to contradict myself now. I recently had a call with someone I'm mentoring. So he's now at the end of his master's degree and was wondering, should I go in this direction or should I go? It was basically sustainable startup or big corporate insurance.
Yeah.
And then I asked him, where are you more likely to find colleagues whose company you really enjoy?
Yeah.
Because I think we're spending so much time at work. So am I the person who actually enjoys hanging out with people who are working in a corporate insurance? Or am I more, or is it more going to be the startup vibe, sustainability, the activists?
Yeah.
So actually you're right.
Although one massive caveat to actually lots of the things we're talking about here is that one of my strongest values is also fun. So I'm coming at this very biased because I will probably optimize most decisions for what's the most fun thing to do here. So I'm super biased with this. And people will have different values and some people don't value fun, which is fine. They've got different values. And I think part of an individual's decision-making process should be guided towards what's going to close the gap between where I am now and what I value and kind of get that gap closer. And if you don't value fun, then don't prioritize that as a decision-making metric. Even though I believe everyone should be having fun all the time.
Yeah. Yeah, and maybe the word fun is too extreme for some. But I think some joy, some levels of joy.
Enjoyment.
Yes.
Yeah.
Hello, listener. Are you tired of listening to my podcast voice praising our sponsor Session Lab in each episode? I think it's time to pass the mic over to you. So if you are as much of a Session Lab fan and user as I am, please share your experience and praise, and don't be shy of add a sentence of self-promo. Send me your soundbite and you might hear yourself on the next show and find your name and URL in the show notes. I'm looking forward to hearing from you.